So I have recently rewatched the Deadwood TV series for a second time over the last few months in preparation for the HBO movie based on the TV series that has now been released. But as of now, I still haven't seen it, which is entirely intentional, as I will be attempting a kind of haphazard retrospective of my thoughts on the TV show. So this retrospective will be completely all over the place if you haven't realised by now, but I will try my best to surmise my thoughts on the TV series in this, like I said, haphazard retrospective of sorts. So the first season of Deadwood takes place in 1876. I believe it's 6 months after the founding of the camp, and the series kind of follows the various cast of characters in this western town over the next few years as the town evolves to be slightly more orderly and a bit more civilized as forces like law and government enter the town, as Deadwood prepares itself for entry into the Dakota Territory. And now, while that evolution is certainly a big part of the show and definitely forms the backbone of many storylines, it's mainly a show about the characters and their interactions rather than this story-heavy, plot-driven show. It's much more character-driven, although there are elements like the government, and it's also fair to say that the town organises itself from the chaos as much due to gold and the possibility of wealth, much more than it feels perhaps as a necessity for civilization. They're doing it because they want to get rich, baby, basically. So listen, I'm a big fan of the Western genre in general. It's probably one of my favourite genres, and it's probably, to be fair, what first attracted to me to the show. But I feel like a lot of the things that you would typically associate with the genre, again, aren't the driving force behind the show, which is again great in a way, as it feels very much like these people are, I guess, entrenched in their time and their period setting, rather than perhaps manipulated, if you want to use that word, by the Western genre's constraints. Deadwood, I don't know, on this rewatch, almost feels like a David Simon show, kind of like the Treme of the West, which would be a good way of describing it, I suppose, in my opinion. One thing I noticed when watching the show on this rewatch was and how it does a great job of integrating historical characters with fictional characters, similar in a way to another HBO show like Rome, actually. It very much depicts the characters of kind of like people of their time rather than living myths, which I feel sometimes historical movies and TV shows and even biopics actually make this mistake of doing. Another reason why they pull that off so well, admittedly, is because, you know, before Deadwood, I only had really heard of Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane to a lesser extent. To be honest, I've never heard of people like Seth Bullock and Swearengen, let alone knew the outcome of what happened to them. So I never felt like I knew what was going to happen with any of these characters, basically because, you know, I was unfamiliar with them. But it is a credit to the writing that both the historical and the fictional characters felt very authentic. Even Wild Bill, who I was very familiar with, actually, I didn't know how he died, and I really enjoyed Keith Carradine's performance of a man struggling to live up to his own legendary status, which he managed to achieve actually in his own lifetime. But Carradine plays Bill very much like a man plagued and weary, world weary, I suppose, by the decisions he made throughout his life. Wild Bill's arc in Deadwood kind of reminded me of another movie I love, The Assassination of Jesse James, that it has very much that feeling of a figure burdened by his own notoriety, and not to say craving death, but certainly kind of expecting it on a daily basis, and tired, very tired in a way that perhaps somebody much older than him would feel. The cast in general is fantastic, really, actually, and many, to my mind anyway, give career best performances. Timothy Olyphant as Bullock, Ian McShane as Al Swearengen, Kim Dickens, who I absolutely love as an actress, who was also in Treme, incidentally, actually. William Sanderson as E.B. Farnham. I've only really seen him in Deadwood and Blade Runner, actually, and he's brilliant in this, the ultimate snake. And then we have characters like Powers Boot, who plays Cy Tolliver. Even John Hawkes, who was saddled with a very, I guess, nice guy kind of character called Soul Star, does great. And again, it's mainly because the characters are written so well and have such great dialogue. I don't think the majority of the cast, to be honest, has been much better in anything than they have been in Deadwood. A special mention actually has to go to the very, very underrated Garret Dillahunt, who plays two completely different characters in two completely different seasons, in season 1 and season 2. And it's far from a cheap gimmick. It's a testament to his acting ability that I didn't even realise it was the same actor until I read it. In season 1, he plays this kind of local yokel who, I guess, to put it kindly, embodies all the stereotypes of a drunken hick, but he doesn't play the character as one note by any means. And in season 2, he plays maybe the most detestable character in the show. It's arguable, which I'll get to an interesting conversation about that in a little while. Why we are drawn to some detestable characters more than others. I'll get to that in a minute, but he plays a character in season 2, and I don't evoke this name lightly, but Dillahunt, he plays this guy, Francis Walcott, with a chameleon, like almost shape-shifting ability from the way he plays Jack McCall in season 1. That is almost kind of what Daniel Day-Lewis does when he plays characters. He kind of embodies the character he plays. It feels like he inhabits different people rather than plays roles, and that's certainly what Dillahunt does in this, and he's an extremely underrated actor. Anytime he appears, no matter what the movie, big or small, he's absolutely brilliant, and I kind of hope he turns up in the Deadwood movie, playing a completely different character again, even if it's in a scene. That would be absolutely fantastic. Now, I do want to talk about what for me, anyway, is the most fascinating character on the show, and that's Al Swearengen, played by the wonderful Ian McShane. I mean, we have had anti-heroes like this before, and Swearengen is up there with the best characters and the best anti-heroes, like Walter White and Tony Soprano. I mean, Swearengen is such a larger-than-life character, but he is really heinous as well, and I think way more casually abusive and ruthless than somebody like Tony Soprano, and certainly Walter White anyway. I mean, I'm sure loads of people will debate me on that, and I'm sure they will have strong cases in which to do so. But I just think because it's the 1800s, it's a lot more ruthless and cutthroat world we're in on a daily basis. But for me, what Swearengen is a lot more ruthless and abusive to his women, to his workers on a day-to-day basis, Whereas people like Tony Soprano, he does it when he has to. And what's interesting as well, actually, is the series open and ends with Al Swearengen contemplating committing in some cases, which I don't want to spoil, but he either carries out or threatens to carry out really terrible acts. Now, part of the joys of shows like this is we get to enjoy the ride of these characters without any moral judgments, or at least I believe that is how art and media should be approached personally. And I think it's a big bonus when it comes to film and TV in general that we get to spend time with these characters without having to live with their actions personally. We can enjoy the company of these characters without being morality gatekeepers. We can have problems with what they do while still loving what they do and everything about the character, and it's fun to spend time with them. But I actually had forgotten the whole hooker switcheroo, shall we call it, that happens in the final episode of season 3, and it completely shocked me all over again, to be honest. And in a way, both what Swearengen wants to do when we first meet him in season 1 and what he wants to do in season 3, are, from his point of view, actually very pragmatic decisions and makes absolutely great sense from the character's standpoint. The ending of season 3, it sickened me in a kind of way that only good art can, and it hit me a lot harder than what happens early in season 1, which I guess for anybody that's seen the show is for obvious reasons, really. But on this retrospective watch, I found the question of Al Swearengen a very complex one. Now, anyone that knows me will know I'm not the morality police, so don't take my searching for answers on this to be that at all, please. But I did wonder on this rewatch why somebody like Cy Tolliver or even Walcott or George Hurst, for that matter, antagonised me so much, while somebody like Al Swearengen, who arguably does as much bad as them, why I was rooting for Team Swearengen and why was I so fascinated by every aspect of his character. And I guess the first answer to that is that he is such a charismatic, funny, quick-witted character. So no matter what he is doing at any time, his entertainment factor outweighs every other aspect of what he does, really. Which, if you compare that to somebody like Cy Tolliver, who is much more bitter going about his business, even if it's the same kind of business as Swearengen. Swearengen is the epitome of entertainment at all times, which I find that amazing, really. As long as the Omer Whites or the Tommy DeVitos of the world conduct their business in a manner that appeals to us, we can set aside the same things that are the reason why we resent other characters, even within the same movie or TV show. It's all about entertainment, I suppose. Another thing about Al Swearengen as well, actually, I really enjoyed watching, was the brutal forms his own humanity has taken on, whether it's through his upbringing or the environment, or just from the time that we're in, the 1800s, or who he is actually surrounded by. These kind of oddball collectives of allies and people who depend on him, who, if they didn't have him, would, funnily enough, arguably be in a much worse place than they are under Al's stewardship. I mean, somebody like Jewel, who in Al's words is a gimp, who he keeps around, that he rescued her from an orphanage, I believe, and he's so mean and cruel to her on one hand, but on the other hand, you know, treats pretty good and protects her in many ways and cares for her in his own messed up way. It's such a contradictory relationship, as relationships with almost everybody he interacts with, to be honest. And he's arguably much more tolerant and curious about people who don't come from his world as well, like the newspaper editor or the theatre director played by Brian Cox. And just any time Al Swearengen is interacting with any character, really, and I haven't even got to his dueling with Timothy Oliphant yet, and their explosive energy anytime they share a screen together. But, you know, I could go on all day about this, but I guess to surmise, Ian McShane's portrayal of Al Swearengen is maybe the most definitive portrayal of an anti-hero you will ever see. The other thing as well about the likes of Al Swearengen and Cy Tolliver, which I kind of touched on with Jewel, is they have this network of people who depend on them for better or for worse. I mean, Jewel would be out on the street without him. But the other characters who frequent the gym, which is the salon, he's not getting his hair done, a saloon, Swearengen runs, like Dan Doherty or Johnny, they're actually completely lost and not at all self-sufficient when they don't have Swearengen to guide them. Similar to the characters at the Bella Union when it comes to Cy Tolliver. And there are times when both these characters are completely laid up and out of action, and we kind of get to see both these places and the characters who surround the likes of Al Swearengen and Cy Tolliver fall apart without them, which again, I felt it was a great way of showing just one of the many reasons why a lot of these characters tolerate this abuse and their place in life, I suppose. And kind of expanding on that as well. I mean, the times when the likes of Al Swearengen and Cy Tolliver are laid up in Deadwood, whether it's due to sickness or a fight or various other things which I don't want to really spoil. But this is where the particular pacing of Deadwood comes into its own. I believe, and I could be wrong, but each episode takes place over the space of roughly about a day. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that the episode that immediately precedes the last episode is the next day or anything like that, but because of the slow pacing of each episode and the general small time span each season takes place around, there are a few things very unique to Deadwood that we don't see often. And one of those things is, to put it mildly, the blows hit much harder. If characters get involved in a physical fight, or characters fall ill, or get stabbed, a lot of stuff happens in this show like that, but we are left with the ramifications of that and the consequences and the toll these kind of things take on the characters for much longer than we would in other TV shows, because the characters are left with the wounds for many episodes, so to speak. So everything hits much harder. And what that does is it kind of preps us for any time there is going to be a confrontation. That, number one, it matters, no matter how innocuous the battle or confrontation might seem. And number two, there is a certain fragility to even the toughest characters in this show that we'll see over a number of episodes. For example, there is an absolutely epic clash between two characters later on in this show that's a real slugfest. Think of some of the best one-on-one fights in something like Game of Thrones, but a kind of barroom brawl feel to it. No Jackie Chan shit, just some real powerful blows and punches. And because of the pacing of the show and how wounds have been portrayed over a number of episodes. When you're watching the fight, every blow in this fight feels like it matters in the long term, and it's one of the most memorable on-screen fights that I've ever seen, and not necessarily for the reasons you would normally associate with fights, but just because of the pacing we've had up to this point as well when it comes to injuries and the ramifications of that. A lot of people, I guess, might find the pacing slow. I don't really, because I'm much more interested in the characters rather than everyone being driven by story arcs. And don't get me wrong, there are some great story arcs in Deadwood, but much of the joy from this show is just spending time with these characters and having them interact together and live their lives, as I mentioned previously. Another character I want to touch on, actually, and it's Seth Bullock, played by Timothy Olyphant, who is such an underrated actor as well, really. And it's funny because I remember him being a big part of the show, but he isn't as much the focal point as I remember. I mean, his presence at all times remains large, but I think so much of the town is fleshed out and full of interesting characters that he is as much a cog in the machine as everyone else, and that's a good thing. But I didn't realise that was the case until this time round. The other thing is as well is that actually Seth Bullock in this portrayal of him anyway is a pretty shit sheriff, actually. I mean, as I mentioned, Timothy Olyphant plays him brilliantly as a man unhinged, and it's not so much that he is a fireball of anger that you can kind of see all over his face at all times that makes him such a compelling, volatile watch. It's the fact that Oliphant plays Bullock as a man desperately trying to contain his more volatile nature. It's that balancing act on his face and his expression and his eyes in every scene that makes, anytime we see Timothy Olyphant in Deadwood, no matter how minor or major, it just makes the scene completely dynamite. And I guess that's kind of why I thought of him as a much more focal point of the show than he actually is. I mean, as I mentioned, don't get me wrong, he's still a very significant character, but not so much in the way he is in something like Justified, which is, for some reason, is what I imagined his role in Deadwood was. I guess that comes from the last time I watched it, which was back in 2008. But yeah, absolutely terrible sheriff at times. Jeopardizes the camp on many occasions. Beats the shit out of some characters without any real justification at all at times. And without giving away anything. And I guess this would have been explored in season 4 had it not been cancelled. But what I'm looking forward to seeing handled in this movie is that a lot of characters, Bullock, Charlie Utter, Trixie, Soulstar, they all become complicit by their very passive nature and their lack of interjection due to various motivations in the shocking events that play out in the season 3 finale, which I, as I mentioned, had completely forgotten about, to be honest, for some reason. For some reason I thought the cliffhanger ended on whether George Hurst's men would reach Deadwood or not, but this cliffhanger sets up a real nice showdown between Bullock and Swearengen. I mean, it will be interesting to see as well how it's all going to be handled, because the movie takes place 10 years after the TV show, so I guess it will have lost some steam in the minds of the characters due to time, but I can't wait to see the dynamic of the town 10 years after the events of season 3 and the ramifications, even if we've had to wait 10 years, but the ramifications of that season finale, it's going to be good. Just a final thing to touch on as well that I forgot to mention is the use of language in this show, which I like to call Shakespearean vulgarity, which a lot of my friends say about me, if you knew me. But there was a wonderful rhythm and, I don't know, a groove and poetry to how characters swear in this show. I mean, apparently it's been reported that the series had a total count of about 3,000 fucks and an average of 1.56 utterances of fuck per minute of footage. Now, the series creator David Milch has said the use of profanity, and I can no longer find where he said this actually, so I don't know how accurate it is anymore, but apparently he said Deadwood in the 1800s was a pretty blasphemous place, but the problem with them trying to create that sense of blasphemy and what it might have sounded like back then was that dialogue to modern audiences, the characters would have sounded a bit like Yosemite Sam saying stuff like, God damn it, God darn it. You know, all that might have been blasphemous at the time, but it doesn't hold mustard now. So Milch decided, is it Milch? Yeah. But Milch basically decided to update the profanity to have that effect that it would have nowadays for people today by replacing God damn it with cocksucker and cunt, I suppose. But I think another thing that the profanity does really well is it goes a long way to kind of entrenching you in what would be a dirty, uncivilized, brutal place. It gives you a tangible feel to that, and it doesn't romanticize through its language like sometimes other westerns would do. We are constantly aware of the filth and the chaos of the world through its constant profanity and untamedness. Why haven't I done this review in a crappy Western accent up till now? But it's probably for the best. But yeah, that's basically my Deadwood retrospective rambling. I will be watching the movie later this week and get back to you on my thoughts for that as well. So until then, see you later, cocksuckers.